to the Virginia Department of Corrections Kanban journey. I'm Andrea Ross, and I work for Department of Corrections. I'm a business systems analyst and project manager. I've been working there for about 11 years. About 3 years ago, when we moved to Kanban, I became their Kanban coach. At that time, I got so excited about Kanban that I went ahead and founded a local interest group called Capital Kanban in Richmond, Virginia. And so it's just a local interest group that meets once a month, generally about once a month. We have speakers come in. We're up to like over 200 members now, so growing really fast. Also of interest is that I'm a dialogue skills practitioner for Department of Corrections. And so at Corrections, we've decided that we needed to have a unified communications platform. And I'm talking about the kind of communications that happen between people. And so we have this program where I go in and train. We're training all 13,000 employees on this common way of talking together and thinking together. So I will go in and do like a one-day training in a prison with our corrections officers and our medical staff, cook staff, everybody's being trained on this. So that's an unusual opportunity that I have. There's my Twitter handle, Capital Kanban, so feel free to tweet. And my email address in case you have questions or want to connect after this. Another thing that I'm doing that's kind of noteworthy is that I'm enrolled in the Lean Facilitator Certification Program at the Maryland World Class Consortia. And so that's kind of a straight-out lean class. So that's like lean manufacturing, lean medical, lean government. All of those kinds of things are covered in there. That's a 6-month program, pretty intensive. So that's who I am. And so we'll kind of jump right into the journey. So Webster's defines journey as moving from one point to another, kind of straightforward. So I will talk about how we moved from our point A, which was a fairly underperforming, frustrated team, to our point B, which is an engaged, self-empowered team. So before we go further, though, I think it's important that we understand what point A kind of looked like and the context that this whole initiative kind of dropped into. So if you've been around very many Kanban coaches, you've probably heard this. Context is king. So I'll define for you a little bit about the context that we have. So in the corrections industry, there's a big shift in the mindset. We used to believe that, these are criminals, just lock them up and throw away the key. The more contemporary thinking is that these are people, and they have one or more of a number of needs, that if we can address those needs, we can turn these folks into productive citizens when they get out. And these are needs like substance abuse, untreated mental health conditions, lack of vocational or educational training, things like that, things that we can have an impact on. So that's kind of our industry in general. In Virginia, the way that we describe that mind shift is something called the healing environment. And the healing environment is intended for the offenders, for the staff, and for basically everybody that everybody touches. So it's kind of a grandiose idea. It's a great thing to be a part of. The reason I bring that up is because with this shift in mindset, we have really become much more of a learning organization. Because a learning organization, when I think of healing, I think of getting better. And another way of getting better is learning. So with this whole healing environment initiative came this learning organization initiative. Kanban couple more things just about our culture. So these are a couple of things that I think go into, or components basically, of culture. So I think every organization has a cadence. So if you think about like CNN News, you know, they have a breaking story over in the west end of town, and they deploy their team, and they rush over there. They want to be the first ones there. They get halfway there, and there's an even bigger breaking story. So they pivot, and they move over to that story. So this is an organization that moves very quickly. Contrast that to an organization who, say, builds aircraft carriers, where it takes about 7 years, start to finish, to build an aircraft carrier. That's an organization that moves very slowly and deliberately. So in our organization, you know, you see a man here looking out of the window, and he's basically waiting. So we have a lot of, that becomes part of the DNA of our culture. It can't help but bleed over into all aspects of our culture and our organization. So that's one of the things that we are working with, is this long waits. Another aspect of culture is risk. If you were a furniture sales company, and you had an initiative to do a mattress sale, so you bought a bunch of mattresses and you did this big sale. Well, if your initiative failed, then what you would have is some inventory of some mattresses, and that would be too bad. In our organization, if we have an initiative and we fail, then the consequence can be that people get hurt, physically hurt. You can imagine how much awry things could go in a prison. And so our organization is rather risk averse. One of the things that brings about risk is change. And so we do change, but we tend to change more slowly and deliberately, in a more evolutionary way, not a revolutionary way. And then another component of culture is who is your customer? So for example, Verizon knows very well who their customer is. They can tell you lots of things about the profile of their customer. They're very customer focused. In our organization, we kind of struggle with who is our customer. So our customer may be the taxpayers. They're the ones who fund it. It may be the offenders themselves. It may be the victims of the offenders. It may be the families of the offenders. So that's a bit of an obscure question for us, and definitely something that we struggle with. And I think it shows up in the culture. Let's see. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started on our journey. So it is January of 2012. Our IT department's been doing pretty much what we've been doing for quite some time. We have a staff of really excellent professionals, but they were still struggling with the workload that they had. And at that time, the feedback that we were getting from our customers was a real clear call for change. So that was the point at which our leadership decided to go ahead and implement a change. So Harry Emerson Fosdick said, "He who chooses the beginning of the road chooses the place it leads." So thankfully, our leaders decided to choose this road called Kanban. We also had some excellent consultants in the Richmond area who helped us to make those choices. So one of the things that we needed to do was, we have a kind of a small shop, only about 30 people, but we needed to pick an area to start with to make this adoption. So in our shop, we have a core system that we use, which is an offender management system. And that system is basically developed by a nearshore company in Canada. So what we do a lot of is we do a lot of the things that support this system. So one of the main things that we do is we write custom reports off of that system. Excuse me. And that's where we decided to start with. So the first thing we had to do, once we had picked an area to begin with, was we had to kind of understand that area and establish a baseline. So what this graph is showing you is each one of these points is a custom report, and the number beside it is how many days it took to build that report. So we have a report that took 53 days. We have another that took 5 days. We have one that took 79 days. And then along the bottom here, these are just the number of reports that we've built at this point for this graph. So we averaged this out, and we found out that it was taking us about 45 days to deliver a custom report. That's a really long time. With today's technology, you know, maybe 4 or 5 days to build a report would be, you know, standard. We were taking 45. In order to get this baseline, we weren't tracking the number of days in development or our cycle time. That was not being tracked at all. So we kind of had to cobble that together. And we did things like went back and looked at when was the last time the requirements were updated or finalized, and then when did that report actually go into production. So we kind of had to back into our metrics. But at least going into it, we had an understanding, a basic kind of understanding of where we were and how long things were taking us. The next thing we did was we got training. So this was, again, back in 2012. We did the standard LKU accredited training. Had one of the trainers come in to our shop, and it was 2 days, so we spent, they used the learn and do model. And so in the learn and do model, they introduce a concept, and then you implement it right there in your context. So at the end of the 2 days, we had a Kanban board, our Kanban board. And the great thing was that we did it. We built it. And so we had, amongst our team, we had ownership of it. I'll just interject here that the way that I became a coach was that I'm not actually on that team that builds those reports. But I was involved in the training, and I got really excited about it, as I'd said, and I did a lot of study on my own, and basically ended up, you know, the de facto coach, because had I not stepped up to that role, I don't know that it really would have lasted. People were like, I guess the general thinking was like, yeah, we'll sure go along with this, but we're not going to take, you know, initiative on it. And so I'm not sure that it would have stuck had we not had somebody internally to kind of take over the baton. But anyway, we got our training and had our Kanban board. Another thing that's important about that training was that we trained everybody that had anything to do with this. So we, of course, trained our developers and our analysts, our customers, our management. Everyone was in that training. Everyone built the system together, and we all learned together. Okay, so now we have a system. But one of the things we had to do was to really fully understand our pain points. I spent a little bit of time at the beginning kind of talking about the culture and how we had become a learning organization. And I think had we not dropped into that context, we would never have been able to be really honest about the things that were our pain points or our problems. I'll go ahead and use that word. So I think the word problem can be kind of taboo in a lot of organizations. Toyota loves the word problems. They say that you know, problems are our learning opportunities. But I think for most people, kind of the word pain point is a little bit softer. Anyway, we went ahead and looked into what are our pain points. Of course, the one that kind of drove all of this was that our customers were very unhappy. They knew that it was taking a really long time to get work out of our system. Sometimes they would make requests, and the work was actually just getting lost. It would kind of get so far back on the back burner that it would finally just fall off the stove, and they would never see it again. So they were pretty unhappy about it. And they were starting to really make their dissatisfaction known. Another thing that was a pain point was that we had work coming in from all directions, straight into the developers. So, I mean, really, in truth, a fairly immature kind of an organization where we didn't really even have a funnel for work to come into. So our developers would get calls straight from the field. You know, I need this report. They would get requests from us business analysts. They would get requests straight from, you know, the executive suite. They would get requests for data trending. So all this work was coming straight into the developers. And the way that it would come in was somebody just happened to know who they were. You know, Joanne's been there for years, so everybody knows her name, so everybody calls Joanne. Where Betty Sue is kind of a new employee, nobody knows her name. Betty Sue's pretty much idle. Joanne's overworked. So we didn't have really even distribution of the work amongst our team. In fact, we had very uneven work amongst our team. The other thing that this caused was for the developers would have to do all of the prioritizing on an island, you know, all by themselves. And they didn't have any context to do this prioritizing in. So they did a pretty good job, but sometimes they would miscalculate a priority, and something that somebody really, really needed would go undone. And then there'd be kind of a little bit of an explosion in the organization, and there would be finger pointing and name calling and CYA, you know, the non-value added CYA activity. So that was kind of a consequence of how we had organized around the work, which was not very well. We actually had a direction from our management, and it was misguided because they didn't know better. The direction was that you always say yes to work. When someone asks you to do something, when a customer, that was good customer service, when a customer asks you to do something, you say yes. So we said yes to everything. And we had no way of knowing what we were saying no to. So our developers were really frazzled. So our customers were unhappy, and our developers were frazzled. They were really left up to their own devices to kind of manage this world that they were working in. So again, these were kind of some of the not so pretty aspects of who we had become. And I share them because I think that to some degree, probably every organization has some degree of this. And you can see if that's true for you. Only because we were in this healing environment were we able to be honest about that. Prior to that, had we surfaced some of these issues, they would have become that person's problem or that person's problem, and they probably would have been, you know, at least had their, probably would have been punished in some way for bringing those problems up. But now we were a different organization. So those are some of our burning platform problems. So starting out, I love this quote. If you can't tell, I really love quotes because I think that they are very potent wisdom. So E.L. Doctorow, who is a writer who writes about writing. And what he said is, it's like driving at night with the headlights on. You can only see a little ways ahead of you, but you can make the whole journey that way. So starting out felt a little bit like that. We didn't know where we were going to go with all of this Kanban initiative. We had to have a lot of faith. It felt a little risky because it was change, and you know how we feel about a risk in our organization. I think it's interesting how a person might be pretty risk tolerant, but when they work in a risk-averse organization, they adopt that kind of thinking. And so that's where we were sort of starting out. We'd come out of the class, we had our Kanban board, and we had our daily stand-up. So this is what our board looked like initially. We had defined our cues, our work item types. We had put our WIP limits up on the board. And we were told, everybody go and get the work that you have that's in progress, write it on a sticky note, and stick it up on the board. So we did that. And this was kind of our first iteration of that. So over the following few days, though, it started to look more like this. So a lot more work started to come up on the board. And that was because people didn't even know all the things that they were working on. They thought they knew, but as it kind of settled in and over the next few days, more and more work would surface, and they would just come over and put it on the board. It was kind of shocking for us, the amount of work that we had in progress. We had never had a way of visualizing it before. People had a hunch that they were working on a lot of things, but they didn't have any way to quantify it. So being able to visualize it, and in front of everybody, that really made a big difference. The next thing that happened was, as we started to kind of adopt some of the policies, we see the little red stickies up on the board? The little, like this one has a little red sticky, this one. Those are markers of expedited work. So first we got all the work up on the board, then we started going back and applying the expedited stickies. And we started to see that like so much of the work had expedited stickies on it. And that the developers were hopping from one thing to another because we had so many priority one things, everything was priority one, that they were hopping from one thing to another. Well, the truth is, that's what they were being forced to do to begin with, but there was no way of visualizing it. Now we had it up on the board, and we could see it. And we recognized it as a problem. So this really surfaced the problem so that we could deal with it. We ended up taking this problem into a retrospective, saying, this is being very problematic for us. Why is this happening? And it was there that we had a really profound revelation. We realized that we had taught our customers this behavior. So we realized that they would kind of make up reasons like, oh, Mr. Important's got to have this report by next Tuesday because he's going downtown, or we got to have this report because it matches up with this feature that's going in. So they were kind of making up stuff in order to get what they needed out of our system because our system was so unpredictable. Once we realized that, we established a new policy that there would be a funnel for all of the expedited work. And what we saw was over the next couple of months, as we became more predictable, the expedited work just sort of became a non-issue. We didn't even have to manage it anymore. And at this point in our maturity, we almost never see expedited work. I mean, and if there is something, it is truly something that we need to hop off on and put ahead of the other things. So the other thing that happened with expedited work was we now had all of our customers coming to the stand-up. And they could see that other work was getting in front of their work. And they knew that their work had value. And so they began to have conversations. So we would have the daily stand-up, and then while everyone was there, they would see another person who had asked for expedited work, and they would ask them, why is that work so much more important than the work that I put up there? And they would start to have some real discussions about it. So it really allowed for discussion. The next thing that I want to talk about is our blockers. So each one of these pink stickies is a blocker. Prior to putting this on here, and that was definitely something that people were a little bit resistant to, because when we did blockers, we put on the date that it became blocked and the person who we were waiting for in order to free it up. And there was some resistance because that felt a little bit like accountability. But they went ahead and did it, and what we saw was that the board kind of turned pink. Lots of stuff was blocked. We had a policy that said that we wouldn't take on any new stuff until we kind of worked through all of this old stuff, and that we were going to get our work down so that it would fit within our WIP limit. So you can see, like here in this column, our WIP limit is 3, but it's got a ton of stuff in it. That's just stuff that was there because of our initial transition. So we said we're not going to take new stuff in. Rather, we're going to focus on the work that we have in progress and get that pushed on through. But what we saw was that a lot of it was blocked. And so prior to going with the Kanban board, we would have work that was blocked, but each individual developer was left onto their own devices to move that through. And so there's small little voice that was trying to get these things moved through. A lot of it was our business, who didn't really have enough time to do a lot of the testing. So that's what was blocking a lot of work, or answer questions. Now it was visible, and we were able to talk about it, and we were able to swarm around it, so we were able to get through them. So here's kind of the result of what I just kind of showed you on the board. So after about 2 months, we went from the blue line, where we were delivering reports, but it took us a long time, and they were very jagged, and till we get to the red line, where it's definitely not taking as long. The average now is 22 days. And that's less than half of what it was taking us to do before. But even more important, I think, is just the shape of the lines. So the first line has lots of variability in it. And where we had become was a much more predictable. It's more of a flat line, and that's what I think we're really looking for, is very predictable, very smooth lines on this. So this is kind of a rudimentary, very, very rudimentary cycle time. Thing. All right, so the retrospective meeting. Of course, with all of this, we introduced the retrospective meeting. And I did that, and I basically pulled the team together and I said, so this is not going to be like a lessons learned. This is much more of a along the way, keeping the health of the process rather than a post-mortem. The patient is dead. Let's see what killed him. Let's really look at how we can keep this system healthy. So I introduced the topic and I said, so what do y'all think? How often do you want to do this? Let them make the decisions. Let them have the ownership. And they said, oh, this is a really great idea. I think we should do it once every 6 months. So that wasn't the answer I was hoping for. I was hoping for once a week. I negotiated them down to once a month. And they were okay with that to begin with. The second retrospective meeting, I had found the lean coffee. So I introduced that in the second one, and they had never seen anything like it before in their lives. I mean, the meetings that we have are a lot of blah, blah, and posturing, and a lot of non-value added conversations. Now that we had the lean coffee, we were really punching through all of the issues. The issues were surfacing like crazy, and we were capturing those and making decisions and action items and changing policies. And especially in the early days, it was changing very quickly. So it was very energizing for them. They actually looked forward to them. And what we did with what we learned was we put our actions or our changes on Post-it notes, and we had a section on the board for Kaizen or improvements. And we would put those improvements on there, and we'd mark them with the date of when we changed it. And the idea being that we should see some change in our cycle time. Our cycle time should be getting better. Or maybe not. Maybe we instituted a policy that had an adverse effect on it. That should show up in the metrics as well. So marking those and putting them right on the board, they were kind of an accomplishment, and they were also a reminder of changes that we had implemented. Through our retrospectives, we were able to reduce our cycle time now from 22 down to 18 days. And that came over the next couple of months. I like to think about, at Toyota, they say, every employee has 2 jobs. One is to do your work, and 2 is to improve your work. That was a new concept for us, and through these retrospectives, we were starting to become that kind of an organization. So as you can imagine, there was some resistance in the early days. So we'll talk about that. One is just, plain old change is hard for people. And so we definitely had just, kind of general resistance to change. But more specifically, people having to put their private work, this work that they had done on an island, having to share that and display that publicly, they felt very vulnerable with that. Again, we were still moving to becoming more of a learning organization and less of a punitive organization. And so there was some fear about it, definitely initially. Also metrics. So this is interesting. One of the things that's unique about our IT shop is that we, for the most part, are not driven by deadlines. It's pretty much the work gets doled out, and when you finish it, it's fine. We hope it's good quality. So we're not really driven by deadlines so much. And for a lot of people, this is a real plus in working for us. We have a lot of people who came from private sector jobs who felt like they had been really kind of beaten over the head by the deadlines, and they were looking to get out of that. And so they really found refuge in this idea that we didn't have so many deadlines or kind of performance metrics. And so here we were saying, well, we want to gather some metrics on how this team is performing, not individually, but how is the team performing? And definitely saw a lot of resistance to that. On the part of the actual value-added workers, and also on the part of management, surprisingly. One would think that management would be interested in those kinds of things. But that was where we saw the most pushback, was from managers. But they went ahead and went along with it because it was part of the whole prescription. It was part of what we were supposed to be doing. So we did it, and every week or 2 weeks I would have an operational meeting with our manager, and I would bring the metrics to the meeting, and he would go, oh yeah, that's great. But he didn't really do anything with them. We would also post, or I would also post the metrics on the board. Now the team actually saw it as a bit of a game, and they wanted to get they wanted to improve those metrics. They were kind of driven that way, but management wasn't. And so we had a couple of people who felt like tracking these metrics, if we're not going to do anything with them, was then not adding value. And I have to admit that that's the case. And so, although they should add value, but being as they weren't adding value, one afternoon, I marched into one of the manager's office, and they made the executive decision that after a year and a half of gathering and tracking these metrics, that we would just pull the plug on the tool and no longer track metrics. And in fact, kind of do away with all the metrics that we had gathered. So you can, was that a gasp I heard out there? You can imagine how, as a coach, that those are the tools that a coach and that a manager can use, and you've just taken our tools away, and actually the team can use too, to see how they're doing, because they inherently want to do well. But yeah, so they were taken. They just pulled the plug on those. It took me about a week to kind of recover from that, and then I kind of came to peace with it, because I think it's important to know that what we had done was still valuable. And so, what I would call that is a shallow implementation of Kanban, an implementation without metrics. And so for this organization, having a shallow implementation is what worked for them. So I have my beliefs about that, but I can't impose my beliefs. As a coach, I can't impose my beliefs. I can only ask the questions and hope that they see it. And they may yet evolve into it. Okay, so another form of, so that was probably the biggest resistance that we had. Another form of resistance was we had unhappy firefighters or heroes. So we all know the folks, who may even set up a scenario, or when there's a scenario that needs someone to come in and make quick and decisive and informed action. Those are the folks you can count on. Those are the heroes. So now that we had become a much more uniform kind of an organization, those skills that they had worked so hard to develop and that they had been supported in and rewarded for, they were no longer needed. And so there was definitely resistance from them. They were trying to find their way. They were the high performers, though, and so over the years, they have found their way to how to be a high performer, even without the need for being a hero. So they've kind of retooled. They've learned how to operate in this new organization. And then lastly, the unhappy people were the cave people. Do you guys know what the cave people are? So those are the citizens against virtually everything. And they were not happy before we got Kanban, and then they were not happy after we got Kanban. And the cave people, you may know this study that showed that there's kind of an even bell curve that happens in society in general, that there's the early adopters, kind of the first third, or maybe 25 to 30% of the people, early adopters. They're the ones who are looking for the new thing to come up. They're the first ones in line to get their iPhone. And they're leading. And then there's the middle group that's kind of 50 to 60%, and they're basically looking to see which way the wind's blowing, and they're just going to go with that. And then there's that last 25% that are the cave people, and they're looking for ways that this isn't going to work. And they may even try to sabotage it in any way that they can, just to prove that they were right. So we definitely had some unhappy cave people. One of the things that we did to deal with that was probably about the second or third retrospective. Going into it, it definitely was hearing some grumblings amongst the staff. And so I just, at the beginning of the retrospective, said, so I hear some grumblings, and I just want to tell you guys that you have a choice in this matter. I mean, this was a hypothesis, this was a test, and it's really up to you to decide whether we want to go forward with it. We can march right over there, and we can rip that Kanban board down and act like it never happened. We can go back to the way we were, and they, deer in the headlights. Well, no, actually, maybe it's not that bad, and we can move forward, and let's just see what happens, and let's don't go back. So I thought that was a very positive reaction. Okay, so kind of in hindsight, so I'm kind of starting to wind this down a little bit. In hindsight, the things that we learned in my organization were that every time you say yes to something, you actually say no to something as well. There's no such thing as priority one if everything is priority one. So we learned that lesson very well. We learned that problems are only problems as long as you're not talking about them, but that once you're able to surface them, they then really become opportunities for improvement. And we also really learned how to work together as a team. We had definitely been very siloed prior to that. Some of the things on hindsight that I think we did right were that we didn't go it alone, that we had consultants come in and help us, and we had expert trainers come in and help us. We didn't try to just buy a book and figure it out ourselves. We trained the whole team. That was definitely something that we did right. One of the things that we did really right, and I'm so proud of us for this, we put the Kanban board right outside of the CIO's office. So every time he went to his office, he got to see the Kanban board. Every time anybody from the organization goes into his office, they get to see the Kanban board. He also gets to overhear the daily stand-up. And sometimes he happens by and stops in on the daily stand-up. Another thing we did right was that we solicited feedback from our customer, and we posted that by the Kanban board. So the kinds of things that we were hearing were, gosh, before you guys did this, we didn't really trust you. We heard things like, oh, I'm so busy working on these other things, but we couldn't see them, we didn't know what they were, we didn't trust that you were telling us the truth. Now, we can come to the Kanban board and we can see the truth. We really understand more about what you guys are doing. Another thing that we did that was good was we always kept the stand-up short and very to the point. Only the stuff that we needed everybody to be together for and the things that involved the work flowing. And we kept the retrospectives regular. If I could turn back the hands of time and go back to those early days, what would I do? Well, I think one of the things is I would take pictures of the Kanban board every day in the early days, especially when you're very first adopting all of this in the organization, because you learn, it's a real growth spurt. You learn so much so quickly, and it's reflected in the Kanban board. And unfortunately, I didn't do that, and if I had to do it again, that's something I would do. So at this time, I'd like to open it up for questions. Yes?
When you were addressing the cave people, and you said, hey,
Right. Okay, so the question is, what if the cave people had chosen to go back to just scrap the entire Kanban idea and go back to the way things were? Well, I guess I didn't really have a specific plan. I was hoping against hope that they would choose to go forward. I had a feeling that they would, and thankfully they did. But I honestly have to say, you know, if after having given it a good shot, the team in general didn't feel it was a good thing, then probably I would have said, well, let's do it. Yep.
So when management removed the metrics, did they give any reason for why? And would you like to elaborate on, you know, why they might have done that?
Well, they did that because they said it's non-value added work. So what we were doing was on the board, well, we were really trying to pinch pennies. So we were using Lean Kit. We only had 4 licenses. But there were multiple people moving tickets on the board. And so what we would do is, as you moved a ticket, you would turn it sideways. And at the end of the day, someone was designated to go over and write down every one that got moved, and then go back to Lean Kit and enter those. And so there was some overhead to it. And because we weren't really using it, it was felt that the overhead had no value. And that was really the reason that they gave. And then also they gave up I think it was $60 a month for the licenses. So we saved $60 a month too. Again, as a coach, it definitely, gets you right here.
Hi. I was curious, when your whip was overloaded and you worked at bringing that down, how did you manage the relationship with the customers or management that you weren't taking in any new work?
Well, we came up with that policy together with everybody involved. That actually came out of our training. We decided, once we learned about Little's Law and we learned that we were going to have to fit ourselves into these whip limits in order to be more productive, that was a decision that we all made together. So they had ownership of it. So they were frustrated, but we all had to have trust that it was going to work out. And in fact, it definitely did. On hindsight, this was a great journey for us. We learned a lot. We're in a lot better shape now. We've got further to go, but we're in a lot better shape. Yes?
So congratulations for your work as a coach.
Thank you.
Nice job.
Thanks.
And a question is, have you tried to do individual coaches, especially with the cave people? Or how do you work with individually based, or you tried all the time to work with the entire group?
Have I worked individually with, I would definitely say I've worked individually with people. People, come talk to me about the Kanban system. You guys, I don't know if you guys ever heard this, but somebody came to me and was calling it the board of shame. And I countered that with, I don't know about you, but to me it's the board of fame. Because we as a team now are producing so much more, and each individual is able to be much more productive. So that was, an example of how I worked with one person individually on it. So yeah, definitely, as it comes up, I'm definitely the person that, people come talk to. When they want to talk about Kanban, they come talk to me. Yes?
Thank you for the very honest presentation and sharing all the not so beautiful parts of it. I was wondering, and you mentioned this before, where are you now? You started off in 2012, so where are you now in 2015?
So where we are now is we still have that same Kanban system going, and every time we have a new project, we use a Kanban board to manage the project. And where I am now is I am hoping to take this out further into the business. Definitely some promise. So I've been in touch with the director of the Department of Corrections, and there's support for doing that. So taking it out into our core business areas. So I'm hearing that we're at time. So I thank you all for your good questions.